Okay, so I guess good evening, everybody. My name is Dr. Geoff Steeves. I'm a physics professor at the University of Victoria on the west coast of Canada, and so it's almost 11 a.m. for me, so I've still got my morning coffee. Anyway, I'm really glad to be able to speak with you today, and I hope you find this talk interesting. Before I get started, I just want to say a little bit more about my background. So I'm a physics professor at the University of Victoria, but I'm also a professor at the International Space University. And this is a very interesting organization that I got involved with back in 2010, and I continue to be involved with the International Space University. What I'm going to speak with you about today is some of my experiences when I applied to be an astronaut. So a few years ago, the Canadian Space Agency offered an opportunity to become an astronaut, and I went through just about the entire process. So what I want to share with you today is my experiences competing to become an astronaut. So the talk is going to be basically a guide on the 2008-2009 astronaut recruitment campaign in Canada. And these are things to keep in mind for all astronaut recruitment campaigns, whether you're looking to compete in, and become an American astronaut, or I know ESA had a campaign. Actually, there was an ESA campaign going on at the same time that I was competing. So I'll try to just share the experience with you, and then you can ask questions at the end. So in terms of competing, it's very, very important that you prepare yourself well. And for me, that meant getting a whole bunch of different certifications and getting the right training. So I just show my scuba diving certification here, but there are many different things that I did. Then I'm going to talk about the process of applying itself. I'll share some of the stages in the application process, the tests and stuff that they conducted on us, because you submit your application, but then there's a huge experience of being evaluated as you apply to be an astronaut. And I'll talk about that. And then I'll talk about getting selected. And then I'll tell you something unique, that since I wasn't selected, since I'm not an astronaut, I have a unique perspective on the process of being selected and then also getting rejected. Because we can't all be astronauts, but even just going through this process, even not becoming an astronaut, has changed my life, and I hope you will apply and have an opportunity to have your life changed as well. In terms of wanting to become an astronaut, I don't know what your exact backgrounds are, but I was certainly influenced by a lot of popular culture in the 80s. So the movie Star Wars was the first movie I ever saw when I was a little child. I was 4 years old when I saw it, but there are many other aspects of culture and that got me excited about becoming an astronaut, including even video games. And this video game image that you see here was a video game from the 80s where you launched a space station in modules and you actually managed the space station. And from this game, I learned that it was really good to use physicists to crew my space station that I made, and that's one of the reasons I actually went into physics, is I knew physics was an excellent background for preparing to become an astronaut. So depending on where you are and the opportunities that you have available to you, you may have to be very patient. In Canada, we have had now 3 astronaut recruitment campaigns in 83, 92, and then there was a gap between 1992 and 2008. And so you have to be very, very patient, to have a chance of becoming an astronaut. And hopefully some of you see in the lower left-hand corner Canada's most famous astronaut now, Chris Hadfield, who was selected in the 1992 campaign. While you dream about becoming an astronaut, it's actually very important to, try to take steps that'll make that dream become reality. So in my case, I continued with my education and got an undergraduate degree in physics, but then continued my studies until I got a PhD in physics. That's a good starting point, but there are other things that you're going to have to do to be seriously considered. In Canada, it was very important that we have experience with scuba diving, so I while I was getting my education, it didn't cost that much money. I was able to train to become a scuba diver. I got my basic and advanced diving certification. And then once I became a professor, I had the opportunity to learn a little bit more about aviation. And actually my flight training, if you do gliders or fixed-wing powered aircraft, either of these things are going to help you a lot in terms of training. Not because of the exact skills, but because the training processes in aviation are very, very similar to what you're going to encounter if you compete to become an astronaut. So learning how to deal with emergencies while you're flying an aircraft, that experience helped me a lot in the process. So make use of your time. You're going to have to wait probably a long time to have an opportunity, but make sure that you're preparing yourself in that time period. So in June of 2008, an ad came out. The Canadian Space Agency was seeking some new astronauts, and I applied for that ad. It just made me think a little bit back. In the early 20th century, a similar ad came out for an explorer named Shackleton, and the wording of the Shackleton ad is a little bit more exciting. Hazardous journey, small wagers, bitter cold, long months of complete darkness, and so on. I just think it's interesting these two ads came out. I mean, because an astronaut is just a form of adventure, so these adventures have been needed for a long time period, and each ad received about 5,000 applications or applicants. So in my case, this is a bit of the timeline. So if you think about this as a job interview, my job interview started in May 2008 and it ended in May 2009. So it's a very, very long process. And the reason it's such a long process is that they have to really weed down the number of applicants. So there were over 10,000 people who applied for the Canadian recruitment campaign. Over 5,000 of them met all the basic qualifications. And in Canada's case, they were looking for 2 people to become astronauts. I'll be able to take you through almost this full chart and tell you about my experiences along the way. So things began to get interesting in August of 2008 when they requested really detailed application from us. I won't go into that in too much detail, but of 1,000 people who applied, they asked for a long cover letter, a resume and CV. They asked us about our areas of expertise and our certifications and qualifications. And this pie chart here, I kind of showed areas that seemed to be important in order to make it further in the process. It was nice if you had expertise in one, but ideally at least 2 of these areas in order to be a strong applicant. But they were looking for a broad range of expertise. So one of the things they asked us is to tell them which of these areas we were experts in. And you can see it's a huge range of fields that they were looking for expertise in. And then they also wanted to know how much of an expert we were, whether we had just taken a university class in the field or whether we'd actually published original research in that field. So following this, for people who were successful in that initial complete application process, we did medical examinations. So we went to military facilities and they evaluated us. They didn't really have a military medical for an astronaut, but they did have medical exams for Air Force pilots and also for Navy divers in the military. So they tested us with those 2 exams, and if we passed the Air Force flight medical and the Navy medical, then they allowed us to continue in the process. In November now of 2008, I was lucky enough to be chosen for an interview. This was the first time I actually got to talk in person with people at the Canadian Space Agency. It was a very exciting time, and one of the questions they asked several questions over the course of an hour, and one of the interesting things that they did is they actually made sure we had to time our own responses so that we would be able to answer all of their questions within the time period. So there were many, many questions. One of them that they asked, which I thought was kind of interesting and a question that stuck with me afterwards, was this: just imagine what would happen to you as an astronaut if you trained for years for a specific mission, maybe to fly to the moon, and one of your colleagues training next to you was chosen instead. So you had to kind of come up with an answer. And of course, I said, I tried to be very politically correct and said, oh, I would just, try to support that colleague and the mission, and I would have to put my personal feelings behind me. It's an easy thing to say. It's a lot harder to do. But I think in truth, that is what I would do. And this question came back to me later in the process. So that's just some of the boring initial stuff, the preliminaries. And by passing these various stages, I was able to be interviewed and make it into the top 79 of the applicants. And by passing my interview and an additional medical test, I made it into the top 40. The reason I made it, I believe, from 5,000 down to 40 is actually more to do with the training and things that I did before I even applied. So I really believe that getting a very strong education in a hard science like physics or engineering, having a very strong educational backup, also having my aviation experience and my scuba diving experience, with those three areas, I believe I was able to essentially make it into the finals of the competition. And this is where the competition actually really started to get interesting. So at this point, there are 40 of us left, and we began rounds of what are called aptitude testing, where we flew to various locations in Canada and actually competed to advance in the recruitment campaign. So for us, this was the first chance we had as finalists to actually begin to meet one another. These aren't the exact people. I don't know if you're familiar with the Firefly TV show in Bulgaria, but I just put this picture up because it gives you a sense that there were a number of interesting characters that we began to meet as we came together as candidates and finalists in the process. So these were real people. The group I met, the top 39 or 40 of us, consisted of test pilots, emergency medicine doctors, scientists, adventurers, explorers, and engineers. There was an Olympic athlete in the mix, and just a number of very, very interesting people, many of whom had very high-level qualifications in several disciplines. We flew to the Canadian Space Agency headquarters, which is just outside of Montreal, and there we basically went through a huge number of tests. So there were multiple IQ tests that we did over the course of a week. We did psychological tests to evaluate whether we were rational human beings or whether we were a little bit crazy. I think you did have to be a little bit crazy to compete, but they evaluated this. One of the psychological test questions that I laugh about is they asked us, do we feel like we're constantly being tested, right? So, and of course we did during that week, but it was kind of a fun process if you like taking tests, but also stressful because you realize what's at stake. One of the more interesting tests was this RAF Aircrew Selection Test. That is, RAF is the Royal Air Force, so the British Air Force. Because there were a number of Canadian pilots being evaluated, they used a British test to evaluate our skills in hand-eye coordination, things that would make you a good pilot they wanted to evaluate. We also did robotic aptitude test, fitness, and strength tests, and I'll just tell you a little bit about that. When we met in Montreal, we were staying together in a hotel, and the people testing us were staying in the same hotel, and they would tell us everything that you do over the next week is measurable, everything is observable. So it was as important to conduct yourself as an astronaut during the days of testing as it was in the evenings when you're relaxing and trying to come to terms with the process. It was very important to be on all the time during this process. So with the aptitude testing, we were fitted with gas masks on the very first day, and we didn't even know why. And you'll see here just a couple of screenshots. In the upper right is the aircrew selection test, which was a series of tests, almost like different types of video games that you would play, and exercises to see about your hand-eye coordination. One of the more interesting RAF aircrew selection tests that we did, it was like basically playing one video game, something like Guitar Hero, where you have to push a button at a certain time, on the screen. But while you were doing that, you also had to do math problems as quickly as you could in your head and submit the answers. So it was like playing two different video games at once. One was just a basic video game requiring you to push buttons at certain time, but you had to interrupt that game to solve numerical problems, just simple addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division as quickly as you could. And in addition to that, at the same time, they would periodically flash a series of letters on the screen. You'd have to try to memorize those letters, and then in 30 or 40 seconds, they would give you a multiple choice test to recall the letter string that they'd put up on the screen. So 3 video games at once, and you had to divide your attention between all 3 activities. In the lower right is a simulator for flying Canada's robotic arm, which is on the International Space Station. And they had exercise for us there where we had to grapple a satellite with the robotic arm and move it around. There was a physically demanding component to the testing in Montreal. We had to do many exercises in the swimming pool and underwater. In the bottom right-hand corner of the screen, you'll see an image of a simple kind of child's puzzle where there's a cube and different shaped holes on each face of the cube, and you had to insert little puzzle pieces into the appropriate hole. Well, I mean, it's very easy for a child to do a puzzle like this, but it makes it a little bit more challenging when you have to hold your breath and do it underwater. So a lot of interesting activities. We also went to a military base where they evaluated our physical fitness, and that was another very challenging component of this activity. Certainly challenging for me. I'm a physicist. I'm used to sitting at my desk here in Victoria. I'm not used to being ordered around by military personnel who are trying to see how fit I am. That was what happened in Montreal, and from here things got quite interesting. I went back to my normal job. You may wonder, how did I balance this with my career? Well, the fact was I had to talk to my employer and tell them that I was involved in this process, and it was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, and they were very generous in letting me leave my job for 1 week in January, 1 week in February, 1 week in March. The Canadian Space Agency gave me no flexibility. None of us had any flexibility. We had to attend these aptitude phases, otherwise we would be disqualified. So in February, our testing continued. We were flown to a location on the east coast of Canada. They didn't even tell us where we were going until a few days before we had to leave. They told us the dates, but they didn't tell us the location. In Halifax, on the east coast of Canada, we did a number of activities. One is called helicopter underwater egress training, and then we also did what's called a damage control course. This was a very different type of testing, and here what they were trying to do is put us in stressful situations and time sensitive with fear of drowning, fear of fire, fear of chemical spills, and they wanted to see how well we performed under pressure. So the image that you see here is a device for what's called helicopter underwater egress training, and it's used to train people who have to fly helicopters long distances over the ocean. What can happen is if your helicopter is flying over the ocean and it has an engine failure, there is a way for the pilot of the helicopter to land the helicopter on the surface of the ocean gently by auto-rotating, by allowing the helicopter blade to spin, and by controlling the pitch. It is possible, even without power, to set the helicopter down gently on the surface of the ocean. But once the helicopter touches down, the heavy motor on the top of it will cause the helicopter to basically flip upside down and sink. And so there is special training for getting out of a helicopter in such a circumstance. And as a way to see how well we performed under pressure, they gave us a little introduction to helicopter underwater egress training, and then they tested us. So they strapped us into this blue device that you see on the left, lowered us down into that water. The device, the simulated cockpit, flips upside down and sinks, and we had to get out safely. So this was a little bit stressful the first time we did it, but I still remember the exact instructions on how to get out of this helicopter simulator today. So obviously the training was effective. As the cockpit is lowered into the water, it flips over very, very rapidly, and you have to stay strapped in your seat and just take a big breath of air as that happens. Once the helicopter settles underwater and upside down, only then do you begin to work your way out of the helicopter. First by trying to open one of the windows, and only once you've got an escape route planned out do you release yourself from your safety harness and start making your way out of the cockpit. This can happen in the day or at night, so it's very important to keep your safety belt on until you've figured out your plan of exit, because if you naturally just undo your seatbelt as soon as you land, as the helicopter is tossing and tumbling underwater, you can lose your orientation, and if it's dark, you'll never be able to make it out. So it's a very challenging test. What they did for us is they made us do this test 3 different times using 3 different exits, simulating the fact that one exit may not be accessible. So it was a really challenging activity. If the fear of underwater is something that you can overcome, they had additional challenges for us that week. One of them was a damage control course. This is normally a 2-week course, but we essentially went through a condensed 1-day version of it where we were trained in firefighting, flood control, and hazardous material control. And the next day, we worked together in teams without guidance to try to put out fires, evacuate people from hazardous material spills, and also prevent floods from occurring in a sinking ship. So this was a very realistic simulator with real fire, real water, and it was a very challenging portion of our competition, probably the most physically challenging, very stressful, because you're working in unfamiliar equipment in extremely hazardous environments, and it's a lot of hard physical work, and that creates stress and makes for a challenging day. So in one day we were tested in firefighting, flood control here, and hazardous material spills. The flood control, basically you are in a small contained compartment which is on a ship, and they are able to flood this compartment through various openings, through doorways, through hatches in the floor, and so on. You have to figure out where the flood is coming from, and you have to build structures out of 4x4s to apply pressure to various hatches and doorways to prevent water from entering the compartment and ultimately to pump that water out. The water, this was taking place in Canada in February, and this was outdoor water from a lake that was pumped in, so it was incredibly cold, just a few degrees above 0 Celsius. And we were going back and forth between activities in the water like this and firefighting, so it was very stressful physically. We also had to do things like patch bursting pipes, and then also do our evacuation of personnel from hazardous areas. The top right corner of the screen, so this was a very, very tough day. And at the end of the day, we had to actually do what was the most challenging thing, really, was we had worked together as a team throughout the day, and at the end of the day, when they told us we were done, we were just mentally and physically exhausted. What they had us do then, and I'm told that this is something they really do for real astronauts when they're training, is they had us actually evaluate the performance of our team members. So we had worked together with these individuals throughout the day, and at the end of the day, you actually feel a great sense of accomplishment and relief at having survived all the activities. Having to then analyze the performance of your friends, realizing that this could disqualify them from ever being an astronaut, was a very hard thing to do, but also a realistic exercise.